Okay, so while the presentation is loaded, I'll just quickly introduce the project first of all. So I'm representing USAID RISE, which is Renewable Integration Sustainable Energy. It's a 4-year program by USAID. It's a bilateral agreement with US government and Ministry of Power. And the program was focused largely on implementing innovative technology solutions for integrating large volumes of renewables into the grid. So technology solutions, when I say, so it varies from storage technologies as well as kind of overall reorganization or redesigning of the electricity markets, coal flexibility and other things, and amongst which was one, of course, integrating EVs into the grid as well. So this presentation will be largely on the experiences, what we have gathered during the project. This project was commissioned by Ministry of Power along with a Delhi-based utility, private utility, so whose network data we have used to model various scenarios of EV penetration, and the results will be shown as a part of the presentation as well. And during the process, of course, we interacted with a lot many US experts and as well as US utilities. And like we saw, I think it's inseparable that the electricity utilities and the transport agencies work together to make this dream happen. No transportation can be electric, means completely transformationally, I think, converted to EVs unless and until there is a lot of support and a lot of equal kind of, I would say, investment coming from the utilities as well. So that's primarily the experience which says how the Western world has also kind of, I would say, gone about transforming the electric mobility. So largely, my presentation will cover the key impacts on distribution network and mitigation measures. Second is, of course, the modeling the impact of EVs on the distribution network and why is that important. Third will be, of course, the regulatory interventions and enablers which are required. And fourth is the key takeaways for the Indian policymakers and as well as regulators and as well as utilities and the transport agencies. Right. I think broadly we agree that so there was a study long back, probably 4 or 5 years back, which was commissioned and which come out saying that the impact of or EVs on the grid is minimal. But that's like not an easy task to say that. There are different factors, there are different, I would say, geographical considerations as well, load profiles as well as many other factors considers that there might be high impact also on the electricity utilities depending on which time the EVs get kind of charged, what is the kind of profiles, what is the kind of penetration. So all these effects, what happens is there are impacts in the distribution network. So largely this is categorized as the network upgrades. So it will require, of course, upgradations in the network if by and far you want to accommodate more and more EVs into the grid. There will be impacts on components because of voltage fluctuations, because of transformer overloading. There will be losses in the system and therefore there will be an impact in the life as well. And the third most important is the location. When I say location is you already have an available infrastructure. So choose your kind of EVSE locations in an optimal fashion so that the available infrastructure can be utilized in a more kind of appropriate manner. No point planning an EVSE where you don't have a network, so it adds to the investment, it adds to a kind of a delay. So there needs to be some kind of a modeling there as well. What is the optimal EVSE locations, which are the feeders which will be more prioritized and which are the feeders which will be less prioritized. And of course, the last one is a business model. This business model is more from the regulatory perspective. Like say for example, if you do managed charging, which is again a very kind of recent topic, what's been researched or what's been implemented in US and as well as Western countries, there are incentives to be given to the EV users as well for managed charging. There are active and passive managed charging, which I will explain. And therefore, the business models of EV charging has to evolve depending on that. Now, there are these large kind of, I would say, the issues which happens in the network. One is, of course, the voltage stability issues, which I said, of course, leads to reduced reliability and, of course, your life gets affected, your network profiles get affected based on the consumer. And then there are again, uncontrolled charging. So uncontrolled charging means if you don't have any managed charging in the network, if you don't have a TOU pricing, then what happens is it could add to your load profile, it could add to your peak loads, and therefore the utilities spend a lot more than what they usually spend. So therefore your procurement cost gets increased. So automatically there is a component which needs to be supported either through active managed charging or passive managed charging, which needs to come, right? And then the optimal kind of distribution network leading to the placement of the EVSEs. This will be soon experienced by the utilities very soon. Means you can't just really lay out your kind of without any prioritization. You can't just say, or whenever some EVSE operator comes, you just cannot extend a I would say connection without having a plan of yours. Whether it will lead to some kind of a transformer overloading, whether it will lead to network losses or voltage stabilization issues. So you need to model that and see where in the network you have adequate capacity, and therefore you have a rollout plan or you have a prioritization framework which is available to the EVSE operators as well. So this is on a lifetime feed. What has happened in US also, even if say for example DERs or rooftop solars, when they get integrated into the grid, so the utilities give out the plans where you can actually put those DERs and where you cannot. So you need to model that and accordingly prioritize your networks accordingly. Now, lack of clarity on potential impact, that's exactly what I said. Long time back there was some modeling which was done, but that led to saying that there was no minimal impact. But having modeled each and every utility, you need to see what kind of effect it has on that particular network, on that particular utility, on that particular time of the day and hours. So that kind of modeling is required. And lastly will be the impact on cost for utilities. Of course, there is a cost, and how to actually accommodate that cost as a utility is one thing which is getting debated, because probably EVs will be used by a minuscule few to start with, and how to actually, whereas the infrastructure which you lay out will be kind of rate based, will be passed on to the consumers. So how everybody has done that, what is the way to do that is also one thing which you need to debate. This is a busy slide. So broadly it says that some of the considerations which you need to have is before thinking that, or before laying out a plan that by 2030 you need to have almost 30% of your vehicles into EVs. So you should consider these broad things, that whether it's place or whether it's in place or not, or whether you need, what you need to do to actually achieve that. So one is of course regulatory enablers. So whether there is a market for DR or demand response or the EVs to actually participate in the ancillary market is not, whether there is a TOU framework or not, anybody is talking about it or not. So these are things which are important if 30% of your transport gets actually converted into EVs. Then there are commercial implications and technical implications as well. So technology implications I have mostly discussed. So this is on the network upgrade. So there needs to be a lot of modeling by each of the utilities before you say that, okay, this is my say Jaipur city. Over here, I can plan the network first. I can plan my EVSEs first, and then probably in some other network. So these kind of modeling needs to be done. This is just to re-emphasize what kind of issues come in, say, voltage stability and harmonics. There are mitigation measures available. But the key message is there might be several options for mitigating these measures, but what is the best cost-benefit approach which you need to take? If there is, say, for example, a lot of EVs come into the grid, that again needs to be done and presented to the regulator, and the regulator should be aware of that before actually going into that. So there is a process which needs to be working in parallel along with when we actually say that 30% or we have a target of achieving 30%. So this is the work in progress which has happened in US, which the regulators have acknowledged, and which how the regulators have come out with several policies, several regulations supporting the EV transformation is what needs to be kind of studied by the Indian regulators as well, or electricity regulators as well. A typical issue is, say, for example, what I said, if there is no uncontrolled charging, if the EVs can actually come without any incentives being offered to them and charge which coincides with your peak demand. So most of the states have their peak demands between, say, for example, 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock, say in the night. And what we also experience, we'll probably experience that the EVs also get charged during the night, right? So it will add to your peak load, and therefore, if it adds to your peak load, it adds to your cost of procurement, and therefore all the consumers certainly pay for that. So how to actually incentivize the EV users by saying that you charge in the off-peak period, that's important. And even if you have those incentives, there are times where you will face network congestion. So then what you do is active managed charging, or the utilities what been highlighted in the previous presentations also. There needs to be communication protocols between the utility and the EVSE chargers. There needs to be real-time communication protocols where throttling can happen. The utilities, if they want, can actually throttle down the charges as well. So just to avoid peak loading. So these kind of enablements in technology as well as regulations needs to happen. This is just the solutions which I said. On the left-hand side, it's a TOU tariff. Most of the US utilities, all the states have that. On the right-hand side, there are two examples of managed charging. One is active managed charging and passive managed charging. So passive managed charging is, of course, the TOU, and the active managed charging is through modulating, is through throttling down the charging stations. So when an EV is connected, you can throttle down, you can delay the charging as per the utility command. So utility sends a command, and therefore it's done through managed charging. Now modeling and analysis, this is again not a kind of novel thought or what we came out with the modeling that every utility has to do that. This is being done in all the US utilities. What you do is you model your network at different scenarios of EV penetration and see what is the effect of that EV penetration in your grid. What kind of capex you need, what kind of transformer loadings which will happen, what are the kind of availability margins you have in each of those feeders, transformers, and therefore you have a prioritization for each of those feeders, each of those transformers that, hey, I have a plan, this is for you, and therefore all the EVSE operators, please come and set up your EVSE stations in these feeders on a prioritized basis, and then while we add more network, while we augment the network, then these lines remain open. So that's how it has happened. That's the message over here. So planning, then component loading, and then cost estimation, impact on consumer behavior, and optimizing solutions. So these are the 5 steps, or these are the 5 benefits which a modeling can come up with. Now this is the typical kind of a modeling which we have done for a Delhi-based utility. If you see Delhi, it has a typical load curve. In 3-4 months, there is a lot of, I think the load is very high, and within those 3-4 months also, in 3-4 kind of hours, all the transformers get loaded to 80-90%. And the rest of the year, the transformers are loaded at 30-40%. So you can't really plan, and currently what is happening is all your electrical network planning is on the peak load. So you really won't actually do a justification if you do planning based on kind of peak load. If you see that it's only 3-4 hours where the transformer is getting hit, and therefore the EV is also coming into the picture in that time. So what you do is during those hours you can do managed charging, and therefore the regulatory enablement has to be like that. So that's what we have done. We have tried to analyze in a 10-year time scale. We have modeled it, the network, and as well as the load on a 15-minute basis. This is being developed through NREL, of course, was one of the partners, and we have modeled together based on our Python and OpenDSS integrated modeling. So what it does is it actually focuses the load for each 15-minute blocks on a 10-year horizon and find out the transformers in several feeders, how it gets loaded, and what's the pattern of the overloading at various levels of penetration of EVs. Now when you do that, of course the outcome on the small box on the right hand side, it says that, say transformer A needs only 3 hours of managed charging if there is a EVAC station right there. So these kind of inputs comes, say in 2026 or in year 2027, your transformer doesn't need any augmentation, you don't need any new transformer. If you do a managed charging at say 30% level of EV penetration. So these are the some kind of insights which helps you to plan your capex. And what happens also is you develop a prioritization plan, you have your network planned, you know that where are the network or where are the feeders where you can actually lay out your EVSC first or prioritize your EVSC first and then move out to the next one. Now, what are the regulatory interventions which is going to enable all this? Of course, the four main regulatory interventions which have been identified is the cost of recovery of the network. There is a lot of cost, means when you try to integrate renewables as well as EVs, there is a lot of cost which gets kind of absorbed by the utility. So how do you do that? What is the kind of methodology been adopted by the regulators worldwide to do that? Second is the tariff framework, which needs to evolve, which I said the TOU tariff, which is in talks or which is in place for industrial consumers mostly, but needs to have a similar kind of a framework for EV consumers as well. So that needs to be developed state by state. Third is creating a managed charging framework. This is important again based on the modeling. Each and every utility has to model and represent that to the regulator, saying that please enable the managed charging framework, and therefore all the cost associated with that, all the communication protocols, all the standards, everything has to be enabled, and therefore there is a cost to that. And the regulators need to acknowledge that, understand that this is important. And fourth is market-based framework again, which leads to ancillary framework or ancillary kind of services procurement. So what has happened in US, what has happened in UK, they have enabled the or vehicle to grid integration. What we say broadly is nothing but if the vehicles are somehow connected to the grid, all these batteries or the vehicles can actually participate as a demand response to the ancillary market. So these are some of the things far-fetched, but again required in a phased manner when you're talking about 30% of EV penetration. Now, cost recovery of network upgradation and rate basing of make-ready infrastructure. So if you see California is again has a plan like Amsterdam, moving into 100% kind of non-zero emissions by 2030 or something, and similarly moving to electric infrastructure by 2030, if I'm not wrong. Now, how they have done it? So they have rate-based their upgradation. So they are offering, the utilities are offering make-ready infrastructure for the EVACs. And the entire cost of that make-ready infrastructure is being rate-based. What I mean by rate-based is it's actually passed on to all the consumers. It's not that cherry-picking that you are using EV, so you should be bearing the cost. That's not going to happen. If that is the kind of approach the regulators take or the consumers take, this is not going to take off. So that's one primary learning which has happened from the US and any other places. So whatever infrastructure cost the utilities are bearing has to be rate-based. Now, what are the advantages of doing that is being outlined as a regulator, as a notification has come out to all the consumers, saying that there are several advantages of EVs for the consumers as well. It leads to optimal loading of the transformer. It leads to kind of when it's optimal loaded, therefore the losses come down, and those benefits if is shared by the consumers, then you cannot just say that since you are bearing or since you are adding on more infrastructure for EVs, it has to be paid by EV consumers. So it has to be rate-based, that's one. So similar kind of, I would say, lot of important or I would say benefits which have been outlined by the regulator, saying that make-ready infrastructure costs will be borne by all the consumers, and therefore the utilities have gone ahead and developed this make-ready infrastructure for EVACs. That's one step for India, I would say, where the chicken and egg story is happening. When you talk to all these charging infrastructure guys, they're saying even if I put a charging infrastructure, all the costs are going to be borne by me, and therefore the utilization, unless and until it picks up to 30%, 40% level, so I'm not recovering my cost unless and until 17, 18 rupees per kind of a unit. So unless and until that cost is borne by all the consumers, it's not going to happen. That's what has happened elsewhere. So we need to acknowledge and we need to kind of accept that when the regulator comes out with similar kind of a ruling. That's one. And it's really on a kind of capex basis, it's minimal when you actually rate base. So probably not even 1 or 2 paisa or maybe 4, 5 paisa. In a tariff basis, it will affect once you rate base. So that we need to understand, and that needs to be shown by the utilities, that needs to be or heard in the public hearing process by the regulators as well for all the consumers. The next important thing is, of course, the standards. What was highlighted in the earlier presentation was also, I think everyone is moving towards an open kind of standards. For all the managed charging, you have to adopt these charges. It can't be utility specific or it can't be EVSE specific, because it needs to be integrated, the EVSE and as well as the utilities, on a real-time basis. So there needs to be standards and communication protocols which of course our relevant agencies needs to come out following the international standards. And third, which I said, is ancillary framework. So ancillary, how FERC has come out with, how CASO has come out, is they have enabled participation of DR or demand response programs through aggregators. Not each and every vehicle can actually participate in the market. That's like impossible. There is a transaction cost to that. So what you do is you bring in QCAs, which is already there, qualified coordinating agencies, or say for example aggregators or VPPs which participate in the market. So they are aggregators, they will aggregate all the vehicle load, they will aggregate and participate in the market and behave as a kind of resource provider for you. So these are some of the enablements which are being talked about currently in the regulatory regime as well, and probably will hopefully see within this month itself some kind of enablement coming, at least in the ancillary space. So the overall conclusion, the key takeaways is, of course, the adequate capacity planning needs to be done for at least a 10-year horizon for each of the utilities to take an informed decision on CapEx and as well as prioritization of the network. That's pretty important. Second is the impact of EV charging could be substantial. Again, there needs to be a kind of multi-scenario analysis for the utilities to find out what kind of impacts it's going to happen at different levels of penetration and what's my strategy for that. Third is power distribution utilities would be will undertake several kind of scientific studies. So these are some of the activities which they proactively needs to do, like peak load management, reducing deviation charges in lieu of the overdrawals during the kind of peak demand, because EV loads are there. So whereas this is behind the meter, so you haven't really done your calculation right. If you haven't really forecasted your demand, it will ultimately lead to penalties which will be incurred by the distribution utilities. So those level of monitoring on a real-time basis needs to happen, so that those DSM or the penalty charges needs to be avoided. And lastly, the utilities should initiate a dialogue or start representing to the concerned regulators for justification of any capex which they are going to add for the adding of kind of EVSs. So these are some of the steps which is required in parallel to whatever all the policymakers as well as NITI Aayog is planning, the transport agencies are planning. But from the electrical infrastructure point of view, equal support and equal, I would say, in line support is required so that this entire transformation can take place. Thank you.